Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to another episode of Ether Tale Radio Theater. We're doing our mic checks as part of the show because, after all, we're the not ready for airtime players. Peter, can you hear me? Give a thumbs up. So, great. I'm so excited to be here with Melanie Peters and Gabriel Pan and Andrea Vingen and Peter Flynn, of course. We're we're celebrating the bicentennial of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was written in 1816 in a very bad weather summer and not published till 1818. So we're beginning the bicentennial celebration now. And in fact, October 24 through October 31 of this year has been proclaimed Frankenweek. And there'll be events all over the country, all over the world, celebrating this bicentennial. We're going to be a part of it. And we're getting an early start, aren't we? Mm-hmm. When the book came out, Frankenstein, it was published in January 1818. And it didn't really have Mary Shelley's name on it. On the spine, it did say Shelley. And people were probably assuming that it was Percy Shelley. And it was a brilliant book. And you listeners at home, you probably know that it was part of a informal writing contest of great friends who were spending a holiday together. The weather was terrible, interestingly, because of a volcanic eruption that occurred in what is now present-day Indonesia and affected the weather horribly. And there was no summer. It was called the year without a summer. And so they were in and writing and reading and had a contest as who could write the scariest story. And perhaps the winner was Mary Shelley with her Frankenstein. There's so much to celebrate in this bicentennial. And tonight we'd like to just read some passages from the novel. And I'm trying to remember who's up first. It's Gabriel Pan, and I'm just going to switch the microphone over to you, Gabriel. And this is an amazing novel from a very talented teenage girl, Mary Shelley.
When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Bellerive when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. I remained, while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden, I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak which stood about 20 yards from our house. And so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never had beheld anything so utterly destroyed. Before this, I was not unacquainted with the more obvious laws of electricity. On this occasion, a man of great research in natural philosophy was with us, and excited by this catastrophe, he entered on the explanation of a theory which he had formed on the subject of electricity and galvanism, which was at once new and astonishing to me. All that he said threw greatly into the shade Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Maximus, and Paracelsus, the lords of my imagination. But by some fatality, the overthrow of these men disinclined me to pursue my accustomed studies. It seemed to me as if nothing would or could ever be known. All that had so long engaged my attention suddenly grew despicable. By one of these caprices of the mind which we are perhaps most subject to in early youth, I at once gave up my former occupations, set down natural history in all its progeny, and deformed an abortive creation, and entertained the greatest disdain for a would-be science which could never even step within the threshold of real knowledge. In this mood of mind, I betook myself to the mathematics and the branches of study appertaining to that science as being built upon secure foundations, and so worthy of my consideration. Thus, strangely are our souls constructed, and by such slight ligaments are we bound to prosperity or ruin. When I look back, it seems to me as if this almost miraculous change of inclination and my will was the immediate suggestion of the guardian angel of my life, the last effort made by the spirit of preservation to avert the storm that was even then hanging in the stars and ready to envelop me. Her victory was announced by an unusual tranquility and gladness of soul which followed the relinquishing of my ancient and latterly tormenting studies. It was thus that I was taught to associate evil with their prosecution, happiness with their disregard. It was a strong effort of the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction.
Oh, bravo, Gabriel Pan. Thank you for that reading from Frankenstein. And, you know, there are at least 3 narrators telling this story, and also the use of a lot of letters to move the story along. And Melanie had a chance to talk to me a bit about this. She's a big Mary Shelley fan. And Melanie, you're reading one of the wordier letters that's in the novel next, aren't you?
Yes, this is one of Victor's cousins. Victor has been quite ill, and so it's a letter from his cousin with some little chatty gossip.
Well, very important to know.
Very important to know, and inquiring on his health. So, my dearest cousin, you have been ill, very ill. And even the constant letters of dear kind Henry are not sufficient to reassure me on your account. You are forbidden to write, to hold a pen, yet one word from you, dear Victor, is necessary to calm our apprehensions. For a long time I have thought that each post would bring this line, and my persuasions have restrained my uncle from undertaking a journey to Ingolstadt. I have prevented his encountering the inconveniences and perhaps dangers of so long a journey. Yet how often have I regretted not being able to perform it myself? I figure to myself that the task of attending on your sickbed has devolved on some mercenary old nurse who could never guess your wishes nor minister to them with the care and affection of your poor cousin. Yet that is over now. Clerval writes that indeed you are getting better. I eagerly hope that you will confirm this intelligence soon in your own handwriting. Get well and return to us. You will find a happy, cheerful home and friends who love you dearly. Your father's health is vigorous, and he asks but to see you, but to be assured that you are well, and not a care will ever cloud his benevolent countenance. How pleased you would be to remark the improvement of our Ernest. He is now 16 and full of activity and spirit. He is desirous to be a true Swiss and to enter into foreign service, but we cannot part with him, at least until his elder brother returns to us. My uncle is not pleased with the idea of a military career in a distant country, but Ernest never had your powers of application. He looks upon study as an odious fetter. His time is spent in the open air, climbing the hills or rowing on the lake. I fear that he will become an idler unless we yield the point and permit him to enter on the profession which he has selected. Little alteration, except the growth of our dear children, has taken place since you left us. The blue lake and snow-clad mountains, they never change, and I think our placid home and our contented hearts are regulated by the same immutable laws. My trifling occupations take up my time and amuse me, and I am rewarded for my exertions by seeing none but happy, kind faces around me. Since you left us, but one change has taken place in our little household. Do you remember on what occasion Justine Moritz entered our family? Probably you do not. I will relate her history, therefore, in a few words. Madame Moritz, her mother, was a widow with 4 children, of whom Justine was the 3rd. This girl had always been the favorite of her father, but through a strange perversity her mother could not endure her, and after the death of Monsieur Moritz, treated her very ill. My aunt observed this, and when Justine was 12 years of age, prevailed on her mother to allow her to live at our house. The republican institutions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in the great monarchies that surround it. Hence, there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and the lower orders, being neither so poor nor so despised, their manners are more refined and moral. A servant in Geneva does not mean the same thing as a servant in France and England. Justine, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours, and I recollect you once remarked that if you were in an ill humor, one glance from Justine could dissipate it, for the same reason that Ariosto gives concerning the beauty of Angelica. She looked so frank-hearted and happy. My aunt conceived a great attachment for her, by which she was induced to give her an education superior to that which she had first intended. This benefit was fully repaid. Justine was the most grateful little creature in the world. I do not mean that she made any professions. I never heard one pass her lips, but you could see by her eyes that she almost adored her protectress. Although her disposition was gay and in many respects inconsiderate, yet she paid the greatest attention to every gesture of my aunt. She thought her the model of all excellence and endeavored to imitate her phraseology and manners, so that even now she often reminds me of her. When my dearest aunt died, everyone was too much occupied in their own grief to notice poor Justine, who had attended her during her illness with the most anxious affection. Poor Justine was very ill, but other trials were reserved for her. One by one, her brothers and her sister died, and her mother, with the exception of her neglected daughter, was left childless. The conscience of the woman was troubled. She began to think that the deaths of her favorites was a judgment from heaven to chastise her partiality. She was a Roman Catholic, and I believe her confessor confirmed the idea which she had conceived. Accordingly, a few months after your departure for Ingolstadt, Justine was called home by her repentant mother. Poor girl! She wept when she quitted our house. She was much altered since the death of my aunt. Grief had given softness and a winning mildness to her manners, which had before been remarkable for vivacity. Nor was her residence at her mother's house of a nature to restore her gaiety. The poor woman was very vacillating in her repentance. She sometimes begged Justine to forgive her unkindness, but much oftener accused her of having caused the deaths of her brother and sister. Perpetual fretting at length threw Madame Moritz into a decline, which at first increased her irritability, but she is now at peace forever. She died on the first approach of cold weather at the beginning of this last winter. Justine has just returned to us, and I assure you I love her tenderly. She is very clever and gentle, and extremely pretty. As I mentioned before, her mien and her expression continually remind me of my dear aunt. I must say also a few words to you, my dear cousin, of little darling William. I wish you could see him. He is very tall of his age, with sweet laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair. When he smiles, 2 little dimples appear on each cheek, which are rosy with health. He has already had 1 or 2 little wives, but Louisa Byron is his favorite, a pretty little girl of 5 years of age. Now, dear Victor, I dare say you wish to be indulged in a little gossip concerning the good people of Geneva. The pretty Miss Mansfield has already received the congratulatory visits on her approaching marriage with a young Englishman, John Melbourne, Esquire. Her ugly sister, Manon, married Monsieur Duvillard, the rich banker, last autumn. Your favorite schoolfellow, Louis Manoir, has suffered several misfortunes since the departure of Clerval from Geneva, but he has already recovered his spirits and is reported to be on the point of marrying a lively, pretty Frenchwoman, Madame Tavernier. She is a widow and much older than Manoir, but she is very much admired and a favorite with everybody. I have written myself into better spirits, dear cousin, but my anxiety returns upon me as I conclude. Write, dearest Victor. 1 line, 1 word will be a blessing to us. 10,000 thanks to Henry for his kindness, his affection, and his many letters. We are sincerely grateful. Adieu, my cousin. Take care of yourself, and I entreat you, write.
Well, Miss Melanie, that was a lot of information in that letter, and a lot of important information that will tug at your heartstrings later in this novel. Poor Justine. Oh, spoiler alert. Poor Justine. And Melanie, we had a chance to speak a little earlier about the importance of letters in that era.
Oh, well, I mean, they were just, the penny mail was such a big deal. And there was such freedom in being able to write letters. In fact, there was a little bit of controversy with the mail, because women could write letters, private letters, and send them along. What a thrill to get things in the mail when you're really just stuck in a house for most of your life in the country. Getting news from other people is exciting. And
letters are a very important part of this Shelley novel, Frankenstein, revealing a lot of information. And in fact, the novel opens up with letters from a onboard ship scientist who acts as a main narrator at the beginning and end. And in fact, this whole novel, in a way, the secret narrator is that ship scientist's sister who receives all his letters. And technically, that character is the one responsible for what the audience is reading, because she keeps those letters and they become published as the book. Mm-hmm. So the woman's voice was very important in this novel, even though most of the characters are men. Through the narration and the letters, we really get a lot of information. And the poor monster in this novel gets so little nurturing. But before we talk too much about him, I think Gabriel has a passage about how life begins for this monster who has no name in the novel. I know in the movies we call the monster Frankenstein, but in reality, one of the surprises about the monster is that he has no name. Another surprise is that he's a vegetarian. that is revealed when he does learn to speak. He does reveal what he prefers to eat, and he's very proud of being a vegetarian. Fun fact. But in the meantime, there's something very dark that you want to talk about, Gabriel.
It was on a dreary night in November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length, lassitude succeeded to the tumult that I had before endured, and I threw myself upon the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. But it was in vain. I slept, indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth, in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as As I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. The cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed, when, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to a house in which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound, as if it were to announce the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Oh, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. A mummy again endued with an animation could not be so hideous as that wretch. I had gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then, but when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became a thing such as even Dante could not have conceived. I passed the night wretchedly. Sometimes my pulse beat so quickly I hardly felt the palpitation of every artery. At others, I nearly sank to the ground through languor and extreme weakness. Mingled with this horror, I felt the bitterness of disappointment. Dreams that had been my food and pleasant rest for so long a space were now become a hell to me. And the change was so rapid, the overthrow so complete. Morning, dismal and wet, at length dawned and discovered to my sleepless and aching eyes the church of Ingolstadt, its white steeple and clock, which indicated the 6th hour. The porter opened the gates of the court, which had that night been my asylum, and I issued into the streets, pacing them with quick steps as if I sought to avoid the wretch whom I had feared every turning of the street would present to my view. I did not dare return to the apartment which I had inhabited, but I felt impelled to hurry on, although drenched by the rain which had poured from a black and comfortless sky.
Thank you, Gabriel. I hate to be so simplistic, but wow, what a deadbeat dad. That poor Frankenstein, created and abandoned. There is a title and subtitle to this novel, Frankenstein, or The New Prometheus. And here's the story. Prometheus was a titan who was able to shape mankind through clay, much like Frankenstein, creating, a host body with all of these amazing physical attributes that are miraculous in itself. But in this Prometheus myth, Athena was there as well. Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And yes, Prometheus created man out of clay, but it was Athena who breathed soul and knowledge into man. And that's what's missing for Frankenstein. Where was his Athena? And much of this story reveals that as the big issue. You have to nurture your creature, and that sure doesn't happen for him. But the next reading passage we're going to do is my favorite part of the novel, where Frankenstein somehow is able to, get access to a little shed that's attached to a cottage with that a loving family lives in, and he's able to watch this loving family live their lives and learn from them. And fortunately, even at one point, a foreign visitor comes, a beautiful woman who doesn't speak English, and she's taught the language. And Frankenstein also is able to, through this opportunity, learn language. And I think this is that next passage that you wanted to read for us, Melanie.
Yes. I also wanted to say that there's such in the letter that I read, and I believe when they were experiencing this bad weather, they were at Lake Geneva, weren't they?
Yes.
Right. So in the letter that I was reading, there's all this emphasis on the beauty of nature, how beautiful Lake Geneva is, and natural humans. There's so much commenting on the beautifulness of the cousins and little William and Ernest. There's so much beauty. And the monster, who really isn't, if you read it, he doesn't, like when we think of a monster, we think of something that's hideous with, horns and, something very, very incredibly ugly. But the monster it's not so much that he's ugly, it's that he's not of nature. And
there's an uncanny valley moment that comes with him where that's even more frightening than being truly hideous is that something is terribly off, terribly, terribly wrong.
That's not right. Yes. I mean, in the passage that Gabe so wonderfully read is that, first he thought that what he was making was so beautiful. He picked those qualities because they were beautiful.
He handpicked every arm and leg.
and little eyeball. But then once it comes to life, he realizes, oh no, this is terrible.
Yes.
Okay, well.
But in a more beautiful moment now, here the creature sees what life can be like for those who have family.
I lay on my straw, but I could not sleep. I thought of the occurrences of the day. What chiefly struck me was the gentle manner of these people, and I longed to join them, but dared not. I remembered too well the treatment I had suffered the night before from the barbarous villagers, and resolved, whatever course of conduct I might hereafter think it right to pursue, that for the present I would remain quietly in my hovel, watching and endeavoring to discover the motives which influenced their actions. The cottagers arose the next morning before the sun. The young woman arranged the cottage and prepared the food, and the youth departed after the first meal. This day was passed in the same routine as that which preceded it. The young man was constantly employed out of doors, and the girl in various laborious occupations within. The old man, whom I soon perceived to be blind, employed his leisure hours on his instrument or in contemplation. Nothing could exceed the love and respect which the younger cottagers exhibited towards their venerable companion. They performed towards him every little office of affection and duty with gentleness, and he rewarded them by his benevolent smiles. They were not entirely happy. The young man and his companion often went apart and appeared to weep. I saw no cause for their unhappiness, but I was deeply affected by it. If such lovely creatures were miserable, it was less strange that I, an imperfect and solitary being, should be wretched. Yet why were these gentle beings unhappy? They possessed a delightful house, for such it was in my eyes, and every luxury. They had a fire to warm them when chill and delicious viands when hungry. They were dressed in excellent clothes, and still more they enjoyed one another's company and speech, interchanging each day looks of affection and kindness. What did their tears imply? Did they really express pain? I was at first unable to solve these questions, but perpetual attention and time explained to me many appearances which were at first enigmatic. A considerable period elapsed before I discovered one of the causes of the uneasiness in this amiable family. It was poverty, and they suffered that evil in a very distressing degree. Their nourishment consisted entirely of the vegetables of their garden and the milk of one cow, which gave very little during the winter, when its masters could scarcely procure food to support it. They often, I believe, suffered the pangs of hunger very poignantly, especially the two younger cottagers, for several times they placed food before the old man when they reserved none for themselves. This trait of kindness moved me sensibly. I had been accustomed, during the night, to steal a part of their store for my own consumption, but when I found that in doing this I inflicted pain on the cottagers, I abstained and satisfied myself with berries, nuts, and roots, which I gathered from a neighboring wood. I discovered also another means through which I was enabled to assist their labors. I found that the youth spent a great part of each day in collecting wood for the family fire, and during the night I often took his tools, the use of which I quickly discovered, and brought home firing sufficient for the consumption of several days. I remember the first time that I did this. The young woman, when she opened the door in the morning, appeared greatly astonished on seeing a great pile of wood on the outside. She uttered some words in a loud voice, and the youth joined her, who also expressed surprise. I observed with pleasure that he did not go to the forest that day, but spent it in repairing the cottage and cultivating the garden. By degrees I made a discovery of still greater moment. I found that these people possessed a method of communicating their experience and feelings to one another by articulate sounds. I perceived that the words they spoke sometimes produced pleasure or pain, smiles or sadness, in the minds and countenances of the hearers. This was indeed a godlike science, and I ardently desired to become acquainted with it. But I was baffled in every attempt I made for this purpose. Their pronunciation was quick, and the words they uttered, not having any apparent connection with visible objects, I was unable to discover any clue by which I could unravel the mystery of their reference. By great application, however, and after having remained during the space of several revolutions of the moon in my hovel, I discovered the names that were given to some of the most familiar objects of discourse. I learned the applied words fire, milk, bread, and wood. I learned also the names of the cottagers themselves. The youth and his companion had each of them several names, but the old man had only one, which was Father. The girl was called Sister or Agatha, and the youth Felix, Brother or Son. I cannot describe the delight I felt when I learned the ideas appropriated to each of these sounds and was able to pronounce them. I distinguished several other words without being able as yet to understand or apply them, such as good, dearest, unhappy. I spent the winter in this manner. The gentle manners and beauty of the cottagers greatly endeared them to me. When they were unhappy, I felt depressed. When they rejoiced, I sympathized in their joys. I saw few human beings besides them, and if any other happened to enter the cottage, their harsh manners and rude gait only enhanced to me the superior accomplishments of my friends. The old man, I could perceive, often endeavored to encourage his children, as sometimes I found that he called them, to cast off their melancholy. He would talk in a cheerful accent, with an expression of goodness that bestowed pleasure upon even me. Agatha listened with respect, her eyes sometimes filled with tears, which she endeavored to wipe away unperceived. But I generally found that her countenance and tone were more cheerful after having listened to the exhortations of her father. It was not thus with Felix. He was always the saddest of the group, and even to my unpracticed senses he appeared to have suffered more deeply than his friends. But if his countenance was more sorrowful, his voice was more cheerful than that of his sister, especially when he addressed the old man. I can mention innumerable instances which, although slight, mark the dispositions of these amiable cottagers. In the midst of poverty and want, Felix carried with pleasure to his sister the first little white flower that peeped out from beneath the snowy ground. Early in the morning, before she had risen, he cleared away the snow that obstructed her path to the milk house, drew water from the well, and brought the wood from the outhouse, where, to his perpetual astonishment, he found his store always replenished by an invisible hand. In the day, I believe, he worked sometimes for a neighboring farmer, because he often went forth and did not return until dinner, yet brought no wood with him. At other times he worked in the garden, but as there was little to do in the frosty season, he read to the old man and Agatha. This reading had puzzled me extremely at first, but by degrees I discovered that he uttered many of the same sounds when he read as when he talked. I conjectured, therefore, that he found on the paper signs for speech which he understood, and I ardently longed to comprehend these also. But how was that possible when I did not even understand the sounds for which they stood as signs? I improved, however, sensibly in this science, but not sufficiently to follow up any kind of conversation, although I applied my whole mind to the endeavor, for I easily perceived that, although I eagerly longed to discover myself to the cottagers, I ought not to make the attempt until I had first become master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure, for with this also the contrast perpetually presented to my eyes had made me acquainted. I had admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions. But how I was terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool. At first I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. And when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. As the sun became warmer and the light of day longer, the snow vanished, and I beheld the bare trees and the black earth. From this time Felix was more employed, and the heart-moving indications of impending famine disappeared. Their food, as I afterwards found, was coarse, but it was wholesome, and they procured a sufficiency of it. Several new kinds of plants sprang up in the garden, which they dressed, and these signs of comfort increased daily as the season advanced. The old man, leaning on his son, walked each day at noon, when it did not rain, as I found it was called when the heavens poured forth its waters. This frequently took place, but a high wind quickly dried the earth, and the season became far more pleasant than it had been. My mode of life in my hovel was uniform. During the morning, I attended the motions of the cottagers, and when they were dispersed in various occupations, I slept. The remainder of the day was spent in observing my friends. When they had retired to rest, if there was any moon or the night was starlight, I went into the woods and collected my own food and fuel for the cottage. When I returned, as often as it was necessary, I cleared their path from the snow and performed those offices that I had seen done by Felix. I afterwards found that these labors, performed by an invisible hand, greatly astonished them, and once or twice I heard them on these occasions utter the words, "Good spirit," "Wonderful," but I did not understand the significance of these terms. My thoughts now became more active, and I longed to discover the motives and feelings of these lovely creatures. I was inquisitive to know why Felix appeared so miserable and Agatha so sad. I thought, foolish wretch, that it might be in my power to restore happiness to these deserving people. When I slept or was absent, the forms of the venerable blind father, the gentle Agatha, and the excellent Felix flitted before me. I looked upon them as superior beings who would be the arbiters of my future destiny. I formed in my imagination 1,000 pictures of presenting myself to them and their reception of me. I imagined that they would be disgusted until my gentler demeanor and conciliating words I should first win their favor and afterwards their love. These thoughts exhilarated me and led me to apply with fresh ardor to the acquiring the art of language. My organs were indeed harsh but supple, and although my voice was very unlike the soft music of their tones, yet I pronounced such words as I understood with tolerable ease. It was as the ass and the lapdog, yet surely the gentle ass, whose intentions are affectionate, although his manners were rude, deserved better treatment than blows and execration. The pleasant showers and genial warmth of spring greatly altered the aspect of the earth. Men who before this change seemed to have been hid in caves dispersed themselves and were employed in various arts of cultivation. The birds sang in more cheerful notes, and the leaves began to bud forth on the trees. Happy, happy earth, fit habitation for gods, which, so short a time before, was bleak, damp, and unwholesome. My spirits were elevated by the enchanting appearance of nature. The past was blotted from my memory. The present was tranquil, and the future gilded by bright rays of hope and anticipations of joy.
Wow, our monster, our hideous monster is quite the intellectual, and so happy to be involved with this beautiful family. But soon in the book, there's so many murders and so much violence. And in this week coming up, several months from now, Frankenweek, we'll do a lot of activities, and we hope to do something in the Seuss Room of Geisel Library, because we usually try to do something at Halloween time, and Frankenweek sounds like a winner. And one of the things we could do is show some films that are inspired by Mary Shelley's novel. There's even a 1910 Edison silent film, which is surprisingly heady and very psychoanalytical. It's just amazing, and so much more true to the novel than the Boris Karloff moments that are also very special to all of us, certainly. And one of the things that we're going to do in Frankenweek is something that Mary Shelley would have been familiar with is paper theater, the little scale model theaters that families in the 1800s would use to put on that theatrical productions. And there were at least 3 Frankenstein plays based on Mary Shelley's novel that she would have been able to see. And one of them we're actually going to do tonight. And Andrea will do some organ accompaniment for us. And I brought my thunder tube, so that helps. And so we'll be doing that shortly. But if Peter Flynn wasn't in such terrible vocal condition, I'm sure he would share with us what his favorite Frankenstein films were. But all through this broadcast, he's been in the sound room hacking away and coughing, and I've been laughing throughout it. If you wonder why I was laughing at the beginning of the show, is because I could hear Peter suffering so, and I want to empathize, but all I could do is laugh, which is so cruel. Wow. So when Peter's better, he's going to tell us what his favorite Frankenstein films are, and certainly his favorite is the Mel Brooks movie, of course, Young Frankenstein. That's his very favorite, and he's quoting lines from it now. But
Frankenstein.
But he's trying to correct us in the style of the film that it's actually Frankenstein, and it's not Igor. I guess it's Igor.
Igor.
Yeah.
Igor.
Yes, and Peter's doing sign language through the window to tell us all about that.
We're playing charades on the radio.
Yeah. And strangely, there was no Igor at all in the novels. Later in some of the theatrical plays, there was a Fritz, but and we'll be doing a Fritz tonight. That's for sure. In fact, maybe we should do that. Andrea, could you test your organ to make sure it's going, and maybe Peter could listen to see if it's going to go ahead and play. So I wonder if we'll still be able to be heard. How are the levels? Now, Miss Melanie, could you speak a bit while Andrea plays?
Sure.
Just anything at all. Just a sound check.
Hark how it floats upon the dewy air. Oh, what a dying close was there.
So apparently this is going to work out fine. So, yes, indeed. What we're going to now do is one scene from an 1823 Frankenstein play written by Richard Brinsley Peake. And there were 3 versions of his play, and the title changed a bit each time. But for now, let's just call it The Fate of Frankenstein. And Gabriel will play the scientist Frankenstein, and there is an appearance by the monster, although the monster doesn't speak in this particular play. And there is a Fritz. I'll play Fritz. And Melanie, could you read the stage directions for our listeners at home? That'd be great. And Andrea is going to play on organ, and we're just going to point at her and gesticulate. And she's such a good sport. Thank you, Miss Andrea. Thank you. So,
are we ready?
I think we are. We're going to do scene 3 from Richard Brinsley Peake's The Fate of Frankenstein. And what's special about this is that Mary Shelley actually saw this play, and she had a good time in the audience. And she particularly was fond of the actor who played the monster, who was billed as T.P. Cook. She was quite impressed with his acting. She wasn't completely impressed with the play itself, but she had a good time, and she enjoyed being a celebrity in the audience. That was fun for her. So why don't we start with some mood music from our organist, Andrea. Go for it, Andrea. And Melanie will provide some stage directions.
The sleeping apartment of Frankenstein, dark. The bed is within a recess between the wings, enclosed by dark green curtains. A sword hanging, a large French window. Between the wings, a staircase leading to a gallery across the stage, on which is the door of the laboratory above. A small high lattice in center of scene, next to the laboratory door. A Gothic table on stage, screwed. A Gothic chair in center and footstool. Music expressive of the rising of a storm. Enter Frankenstein with a lighted lamp, which he places on the table. Distant thunder heard.
This evening, this lowering evening will, in all probability, complete my task. Years have I labored, and at length discovered that to which so many men of genius have in vain directed their inquiries. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I have become master of the secret of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. With so astonishing a power in my hands, long did I hesitate how to employ it. The object of my experiments lies there,
Pointing up to the laboratory.
a huge automaton in human form. Should I succeed in animating it, life and death would appear to me as ideal bounds, which I shall break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. I have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit.
Storm.
A storm has hastily arisen. 'Tis a dreary night. The rain patters dismally against the panes. 'Tis a night for such a task. I'll in an attempt to infuse the spark of life.
Frankenstein takes up lamp, cautiously looks around him, ascends the stairs, crosses the gallery above, and exits into the door of laboratory. Enter Fritz, trembling with a candle.
Master isn't here. Dare I peep? Only think of the reward Monsieur Clerval promised me. A cow and a cottage, milk and a mansion. Master is certainly not come up yet. Oh, my candle burns all manner of colors and spits like a roasted apple.
Runs against the chair and drops his light, which goes out.
Oh, there now I'm in the dark. Oh, my nerves.
A blue flame appears at the small lattice window above, as from the laboratory.
What's that? Oh, Lord. There he is, kicking up the devil's own flame. Oh, my cow. I'll venture up. Oh, my cottage. I'll climb to the window. It will only be one peep to make my fortune.
Fritz takes up footstool. He ascends the stairs. When on the gallery landing place, he stands on the footstool, tiptoe, to look through the small high lattice window of the laboratory. A sudden combustion is heard within. The blue flame changes to one of a reddish hue. Within,
It lives! It lives!
speaks through music.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
Fritz, greatly alarmed, jumps down hastily, totters trembling down the stairs in vast hurry. When in front of stage, having fallen flat in fright, with difficulty speaks.
Oh, there's a hobgoblin, 20 feet high, wrapped in a mantle. Mercy, mercy.
Falls down. Frankenstein rushes from the laboratory without lamp, fastens the door in apparent dread, and hastens down the stairs, watching the entrance of the laboratory.
It lives! I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. What a wretch I have formed! I had selected his features to be beautiful! Beautiful! A horror! His cadaverous skin scarcely covers the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair lustrous and black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only form more horrible contrasts with the deformities of the demon.
He listens at the foot of the staircase.
What have I accomplished? The beauty of my dream has vanished, and breathless horror and disgust fill my heart. For this I have deprived myself of rest and health, have worked my brain to madness, and when I look to reap my great reward, a flash breaks in upon my darkened soul and tells me my attempt was impious, and that its fruition will be fatal to my peace forever.
He listens again.
All is still. The dreadful spectre of human form. No mortal could withstand the horror of that countenance. A mummy endued with animation could be so hideous as the wretch I have endowed with life. Miserable and impious being that I am. Elizabeth, brother, Agatha, faithful Agatha, never more dare I look upon your virtuous faces. Lost, lost, lost.
Frankenstein sinks on a chair.
Oh, my nerves. I feel as if I had just come out of strong fits and nobody to throw water in my face. Oh, master sleeps, so I'll, if my legs won't lap up under me, just make my escape.
Sudden combustion heard and smoke issues. The door of the laboratory breaks to pieces with a loud crash. Red fire within. Runs out hastily. The demon discovered at door entrance in smoke, which evaporates. The red flame continues visible. The demon advances forward, breaks through the balustrade or railing of gallery, immediately facing the door of laboratory, jumps on the table beneath, and from thence leaps on the stage, stands in attitude before Frankenstein, who had started up in terror. They gaze for a moment at each other.
The demon corpse to which I have given life.
The demon looks at Frankenstein most intently, approaches him with gestures of conciliation. Frankenstein retreats, the demon pursuing him.
Its ugly, unearthly ugliness renders it too horrible for human eyes.
The demon approaches him.
Fiend, do not dare approach me. Avaunt, or dread the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked upon your miserable head.
Frankenstein takes the sword from the nail, points with it at the demon, who snatches the sword, snaps it in two, and throws it on stage. The demon then seizes Frankenstein. Loud thunder heard. Loud thunder heard. Throws him violently on the floor, ascends the staircase, opens a large window, and disappears through the casement. Frankenstein remains motionless on the ground. Thunder and lightning until the drop falls.
More thunder.
Well, I sure look forward to doing that in its entirety soon, probably as a paper theater play during Frankenweek, as an extra little sideshow when we show some Frankenstein films. And we'll be able to take advantage of some of the wonderful artwork that was used in some of the past Frankenstein novels and some of the artwork used for some of these plays, including this very play, which had some beautiful posters made and some wonderful imagery, and we'll be able to use those to make our paper dolls. And thank you, Gabriel Pan. You were brilliant as well. He wasn't really a doctor, as Frankenstein. He didn't really receive a doctorate degree, and there really wasn't even a term as scientist yet in this era. So many of the things that we take for granted in the movies, that it's you weren't a doctor yet. Perhaps if you had had better training and truly were a doctor, you wouldn't have just created something and then abandoned it. Or maybe if there was some sort of board of a review that you had to report to, things would have turned out much differently for Justine and many others, spoiler alert, who perish in this novel. We're almost done. And I think I do have one story that I can read. Oh, I might not have time. I don't think I have time to read the story that was given to me by Peter's son. I don't think I have time today because it's more than 3 minutes, isn't it? And last time, as a joke, I read it as fast as I could, which I think was just not appropriate to the talent of your storytelling. Do you mind if I tell your story another time and give it the respect it deserves, Liam? He gives me a thumbs up, which can be heard on the radio as a thumbs up. I look forward to reading your story. It's always fun when I have to read it too fast, but this time we're going to give it real attention when we meet again. We're always on the air the second and fourth Thursday of the month here on WSRadio.com, and we are Ether Tale Radio Theater. And throughout this year, we're going to be celebrating the bicentennial of this Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and many, many other exciting things this season. Peter Flynn has a pre-recorded radio production that we're going to take advantage of this season, and that'll be very helpful because it's so hard to perform live. And how nice that we'll have something pre-recorded. We can just show up to the studio and eat pizza and just listen to it with the listeners at home, won't you? That will be fun. So grateful to Andrea Vingen for flying in all the way from Germany.
Boy, her arms are tired.
Speaking of Germany, there really was a Frankenstein castle, and it was near Darmstadt, Germany. And there really was a eccentric scientist who had residency in that castle. He wasn't one of the Frankensteins. And people do feel that maybe that's who Frankenstein was based upon. This was a fairly recent discovery for some people, and some people at first thought that maybe Frankenstein's name was taken maybe from Benjamin Franklin and the whole idea of the electricity and the spark. But no, there really was a Frankenstein castle, and Mary Shelley and her parents most likely did visit it. She seems to feel she made up the name, and it's very possible that it's just all not at a conscious level that she brought up that name. So these are things we'll be discussing in this bicentennial year. We're looking forward to it. Oh, I think we just have seconds to go, don't we? Oh, a whole minute? Well, we don't have to fill it. Oh, I know. Could we have more spooky organ music while we meditate upon the sins of Frankenstein? Not the monster Frankenstein, but the scientist Frankenstein who really had a multitude of sins. Could I have spooky organ music while we meditate upon that? Deadbeat Dad. Andrea will play us out. Thank you, Andrea. And thank you, Gabriel Pan, and Melanie Peters, and Peter Flynn. And I'm your host, Scott Paulson. See you next time on Ether Tale Radio Theater. Good night. Good night.